evening, everybody, and welcome to our opening reception for Forever Free, Abraham Lincoln's Journey to Emancipation. The exhibit was organized by the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History in New York City, in cooperation with the American Library Association Public Programs Office, and was also made possible through generous grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I also would like to take this moment to thank all the behind-the-scenes people who have helped. Of course, the Friends of the Library who have helped put this on, and a few of our other programs that will be coming up in the next 6 weeks. Our committee, Ben Miller, who's running sound, Anita Millard, Rita Squires, Christine Hadlow, Donald Spreitzer. However, I'm pretty sure you guys didn't come here to hear me talk tonight. We have a special guest tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out tonight for one of my rare public appearances to discuss my life and career and some of the issues I faced as President of the United States during the great Civil War in which we were engaged. Most of you, I think, have probably heard of me. My name is Abraham Lincoln. I was born in Kentucky in the year 1809. And my father was a farmer, an illiterate dirt farmer. He could barely write his own name. I learned early on that I did not want to be a farmer when I grew up. It is hard physical labor. My father, though, made one great decision in his life. When I was about 7 years old, he moved across the Ohio River from the state of Kentucky to the state of Indiana. He moved from a slave state to a free state. My father hated slavery, and I think I inherited that hostility from him. And we spent 12 years in southern Indiana. I was a teenage Hoosier. In those days, farmers in southern Indiana were called Hoosiers. Farmers in southern Ohio were called Buckeyes. Farmers in southern Illinois were called Suckers. And that's where my family moved when I was 19 years old, into southern Illinois. But soon after that, I left my family and struck out on my own. My first job was on a flatboat, taking goods down the Illinois and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans, where I first confronted the evils of slavery face to face. And I soon settled in the small Illinois town of New Salem on the Sangamon River in the northern part of the state. New Salem was an up-and-coming young village, but it depended on the navigation of the Sangamon River. And that was an undertaking too vast for the community or even the state to undertake. We sought federal help in dredging the Sangamon River. I always believed in federal aid to internal improvements or public works for the public's benefit. But that aid was not forthcoming, and New Salem soon withered on the vine. But it was while I was in New Salem that I was elected to the first of 4 consecutive terms in the Illinois State Legislature. And I regard that political experience as formative in the rest of my life. I was a member of a Whig delegation. We were known as the Long Nine. And one of my most important measures was to move the capital of Illinois from Vandalia in the south to Springfield in the north. And the fact that I had just moved into Springfield to begin the practice of law had nothing at all to do with my vote on that matter, I assure you. I became a lawyer in 1837. In those days, one did not have to go to law school to begin the practice of law. One did not have to go even to a college. I read a few books, figured out where the courthouse was, and hung up my shingle. I was the junior partner in a couple of firms until I hired an assistant of my own, William Herndon, and for 17 years the firm of Lincoln and Herndon practiced law in Springfield. And we were not the country bumpkin, seat of the pants, common sense lawyers that you sometimes read about. William Herndon was an industrious researcher, and I looked at precedent cases, and we increased both the size and the scope of our practice over the years. And by the time I left Springfield for the nation's capital, I was reputed to be at the top of my profession in Illinois. And I represented, as I always like to do, the agents of expansion and development. One of my clients was the Illinois Railroad. In those days, there was a tremendous conflict between ship navigators and the railroads. Railroad wanted to build a bridge across the Illinois River, but the ship owners objected as a hindrance to navigation. I thought the nation could never expand west if we couldn't build bridges over the Illinois Railroad. So I took the railroad's case when the steamboat company sued, and I won. I submitted my bill to the Illinois Railroad for $2,000. The railroad sent it back, said it was a little high. I recalculated and submitted it for $5,000. And when they still refused to pay, I sued them and won. I was at the top of my profession in Illinois. And I was always interested in politics, even after leaving the Illinois legislature. I served one term in the United States House of Representatives, elected in 1846. And I'm proud to say I opposed the illegal, unconstitutional, and immoral war waged by Mr. Polk against our sister republic on the North American continent. Serving in politics and not practicing law was difficult on the family budget. So when my term expired, I returned to Springfield, resumed the practice of law, and only returned to the political arena in 1854 after my senator, the Democratic senator from Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas, introduced and passed the notorious Kansas-Nebraska Act, which you know opened land that President Jefferson had bought, sacrosanct land in northern Louisiana, to the possible expansion of slavery. And I was considered by the Illinois legislature as to become the other senator from Illinois in 1856. I was even mentioned as a possible vice presidential candidate on the first Republican presidential ticket in 1856. In neither of those pursuits was I successful. But in 1858, when Judge Douglas's term was at an end and he was standing for re-election, I challenged him as the Republican candidate. I had always been a member of the Whig Party, the party of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the saviors of the Union. The Whig Party ceased to exist, and I moved into the new Republican Party, a northern-based anti-slavery party. And I challenged Judge Douglas to a series of debates up and down the length and breadth of our home state of Illinois. And like a fool, he accepted my challenge. He was the incumbent senator. He was far more well known than I was, but I enjoyed the publicity and benefited from it. We debated slavery and race and the future of the United States in 7 major confrontations in the north, south, east, and west of Illinois. And ladies and gentlemen, those, I'm proud to say, were real debates. I understand your presidential candidates today engage in what are euphemistically called debates, but are nothing more than glorified press conferences. In the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, the first man spoke for an hour. The second man had an hour and a half rejoinder, and then the first man had a half-hour rebuttal at the end. Now, those were debates. And thousands of people came from miles around. It was the first intensely covered local political contest in American history, and the most forthright discussion of the pressing issues of slavery, expansion, and race in all of the pre-Civil War years. I'm proud to say that more people in Illinois that year voted for legislators pledged to my candidacy than voted for legislators backing Judge Douglas. But his party, the Democratic Party, had holdovers in the Illinois Senate, and he was returned to Washington. But those debates had expanded my reputation, and I received speaking invitations in the West and in the East, in places as far away as Nebraska and Ohio, and even in New York City, where early in 1860 I gave a speech at the famous Cooper Union Institute, and then traveled into the New England states as well. So I was by no means an unknown candidate when the Republican National Convention met in Chicago in May of 1860. I was not a dark horse candidate. I was the favorite of many and everyone's second choice. So that even though the well-known senator from New York, William H. Seward, who became my fast friend during my presidency, even though he was the front runner and led on the first 3 ballots, I was nominated for the presidency on the 4th ballot as the candidate of the Republican Party. And that was an unusual election, ladies and gentlemen, because there were 4 candidates in the race. There was a Southern Democrat, a National Democrat, a member of the Constitutional Union Party from the border states, and I was the candidate of the Republican Party. So that I garnered less than 40% of the popular vote in the presidential election of 1860. But then I was not even on the ballot in the states at the South. In the states in the North and the Midwest, where my name did appear, I won a healthy 55% of the popular vote and an overwhelming majority in the Electoral College. And I was chosen the 16th President of the United States. And soon after my election, but long before my inauguration, the state of South Carolina, a state of which it was said in my time was too small for a republic and too large for an insane asylum. South Carolina, in what can only be described as a fit of sour grapes, seceded from the United States of America. And in short order, 6 other states in the Deep South left the Union, organized a competing republic, the Confederate States of America, elected a former senator and Secretary of War from Mississippi, Jefferson Davis, as its president and confronted the United States when I took my oath of office on the 4th of March of 1861. At issue then were several pieces of federal property, forts and posts and arsenals in the South. When the 7 southern states seceded, they literally stole from the American people numerous pieces of public property that had been paid for by all of the taxpayers. But there were still several places that they hadn't got their hands on. And one of them was a fort, Fort Sumter, in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, the state that started it all. And that had been an issue ever since December. My predecessor, President James Buchanan, didn't know what to do about it, and neither did I. President Buchanan believed that secession was unconstitutional, but that coercing a state to remain in the Union was also unconstitutional. I never quite figured out the logic. But then he was a Democrat. I was beset with advice from all sides, conflicting advice. But I detected a rising sense of American nationalism, a rising sense of Northern patriotism, a rising view not to surrender Fort Sumter. It turned out that the states at the South had always been united on the issue of slavery, but of two minds about the value of the Union. The secession crisis showed that the states at the North were united on the question of union. They may have been divided on the issue of slavery. And so I rode a rising tide of Northern patriotism, and I resolved not to surrender Fort Sumter. And in the end, I simply informed the authorities in South Carolina that I was sending an unarmed relief ship. The gallant Major Anderson had told me he only had supplies at Fort Sumter to last for a few more days. I sent an unarmed relief ship. No guns, no ammunition, no munitions, simply food and medical supplies. But the Confederate government, located in Montgomery, Alabama, believed that a relief, even a peaceful relief of Fort Sumter, would threaten their newfound sovereignty. And so the Confederate government ordered South Carolina to open fire on Fort Sumter before my relief ship arrived. South Carolina did so, launched a bombardment that lasted for 33 hours until the gallant Major Anderson was forced to surrender. Thereafter, in South Carolina, they liked to call it the War of Northern Aggression, but they fired first. I had trouble with their logic throughout the conflict. Following Fort Sumter, I issued a call for 50,000 volunteers. 50,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months. Because I believed, like most people believe, that if a war were to come, it would be a short conflict. It would be decided by the first major battle. That first major battle, Bull Run or Manassas, was fought in June. And it was fought in June because in a couple of weeks, the enlistments of my first 50,000 soldiers would expire. They signed on for only 3 months. But when the Congress convened in early July of 1861, I asked them to authorize an army of 500,000 troops. And the Congress doubled the ante. They authorized an army of 1,000,000 men in the North. And ultimately, over the next 4 years, 2.2 million men at the North served in the Union armies with a maximum strength at any one time of just about 1 million. And almost 1 million men at the South took up arms with a maximum strength in that sector of about 600,000. So, ladies and gentlemen, we had 3.2 million men under arms during the Civil War in a population of only 32 million people. 1/10 of the population took up arms. And over 600,000 soldiers, North and South, perished in the great American Civil War, a full 2% of the entire population of the United States. Now, the Great Civil War began, as you know, as a war for the Union. It began as a war against secession. It was not a war against slavery, although, as I said in my second inaugural address, all knew that slavery was somehow the cause of the war. But it began as a war for the Union, and if the war had ended quickly, if the war had ended at any time in the first year or year and a half, the Union would have been restored with slavery intact. But as the war wore on, more and more people came to see that the secret of Southern strength was the institution of slavery. And just as there had been a rising public tide of support for the Union, there was rising public opinion against slavery. And my cabinet and I resolved to do something about it. We thought we might get off the hook because the war seemed to be going well for the Union after we lost the first major battle at Bull Run. Out in the West, another boy from Illinois, Ulysses Grant, won the first major Union victories in the war at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and a couple of months later at Shiloh on the Tennessee River. And the Union Navy, Uncle Sam's webbed feet, conquered territory on the coasts of North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia. My commanding general, George B. McClellan, had the mighty Army of the Potomac, the greatest fighting force ever established on the North American continent, had that army located 5 miles from Richmond, Virginia in June of 1862. The soldiers in his army could hear the church bells chime in the capital city of the Confederacy. It seemed as if the capital would fall any day. The war would be over in the spring of 1862. And then the commander of the Southern Army, Joseph Johnston, was severely wounded. And the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, named a desk general, an armchair general, with a poor record of command, a man whose troops derisively called him Granny, or called him the evacuator, because that's all he seemed to do. His name was Robert E. Lee. And no sooner did Robert E. Lee take command of his Army of Northern Virginia than he astounded everybody by attacking General McClellan. He had barely half as many troops. But he took the mettle of my man McClellan, and instead of fighting it out then and there for the city of Richmond, McClellan retreated. Lee attacked again and again and again and again in a series of 5 major battles. The 7 days battle in Virginia in June of 1862 and forced poor McClellan to retire into a retreat on the James River, where he was no trouble whatsoever. And then General Lee, with his sidekick Stonewall Jackson, turned around and defeated the Union Army again at the Second Battle of Manassas. So whereas in June, the Union Army was 5 miles outside of Richmond and poised to capture that capital, just 2 months later, the Confederate Army was 20 miles away from Washington, D.C., and we were worried about the security of our nation's capital. Now, I had already prepared a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. I had tried to persuade the loyal slave states at the North to adopt gradual emancipation acts. None of them did so. And as early as July of 1862, I read a draft of an Emancipation Proclamation to my cabinet. They all agreed it should be promulgated. But my friend William Stewart said, "We have just been defeated on the battlefield. An Emancipation Act will look like an act of desperation. We need to wait for a change in our fortunes. We need to await a military victory." Fortunately, General Lee and General McClellan provided one within a few weeks. Just after he won the Second Battle of Manassas, General Lee took his forces across the Potomac River on an invasion of the North. General McClellan met them there in a little town in western Maryland called Sharpsburg on the banks of Antietam Creek, a tributary of the Potomac. And in a major battle, the Battle of Antietam, on the 17th of September of 1862, General Lee's forces were repulsed and he was forced to retreat into Virginia. And I took the opportunity 5 days later to issue the preliminary emancipation. The preliminary emancipation drew a line in the sand for the states at the South. It said you have 100 days. You have 100 days to lay down your arms and rejoin the Union with slavery intact. Naturally, none of the states at the South accepted that offer. 100 days later turned out to be New Year's Day of 1863, the day on which I issued the formal Emancipation Proclamation. Now, my critics then, and some of them still today, will sneer that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave, because it applied only to slaves in territory that the Union did not control. Only slaves in Confederate territory. It did not apply to the slaves in the loyal border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. It did not apply to slaves in Confederate territory that had already been conquered by the Union armies, primarily in New Orleans and Tennessee. I responded to my critics then, and I respond now by saying, by what power did I have to free slaves anywhere except in a military area? The president has no legal power, no political power, no constitutional power to interfere with slavery in the states where it then existed. But the president does have military power as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and that is why the Emancipation Proclamation applied only to territory controlled by the hostile military. But it said, if the war continues, and if the Union wins, and if those territories now controlled by the Confederacy are conquered, the slaves within that area will be forever free. So the Emancipation Proclamation raised the stakes. It raised the ante in the Great Civil War, a war that had begun as a war for the Union now became a war for freedom. A war that had begun as a war against secession became a war against slavery. And I believe that the Emancipation Proclamation endowed the Union cause with a strong moral imperative. It turned a military conflict into a religious war, as anyone who knows the words to that stirring hymn, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, will realize. Now, of course, when the war ended, there were still slaves that the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to in the loyal border states and in the territories that had already been conquered by the Union. Those slaves were freed by an amendment to the Constitution, which I devoted all of my political powers to its passage and its ratification in 1865. The Battle of Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation did not end the war. The war still had 2.5 long years to go. And in fact, the South would win great victories at Fredericksburg and at Chancellorsville before the tide began to turn. And it began to turn, as you well know, in the twin Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg on the same weekend in July in 1863. The South might have won the war militarily if it had been able to achieve a quick victory. But the longer the war lasted, the more the North was able to mobilize its overwhelming strength, its overwhelming majority of material resources, and bring them to bear against the South. There would still be major battles. The South could still have won the war, not militarily, but politically. And for a while in 1864, it looked like that might happen. Campaigns which had begun in the spring of 1864 with great hope and great promise had bogged down by the summer. General William Sherman was stymied before Atlanta. General Ulysses Grant was in the siege lines around Petersburg and Richmond. And in August of 1864, the Democrats nominated my old commanding general, George McClellan, as my opponent in the election, in the upcoming election. And public opinion did not look good. I predicted to myself privately that I would lose my bid for re-election. But then in early September, William Sherman took Atlanta. Admiral Farragut steamed into Mobile Bay. General Phil Sheridan ravaged the Shenandoah Valley. The tide of war turned once again toward the Union, and I was re-elected with a healthy margin, the first president to be re-elected since Andrew Jackson in 1832. Indeed, one of the campaign planks that my opponents used against me was that the one-term presidency had become the rule. Hadn't been a two-term presidency for over a generation. Well, we broke that rule as well. I believe that the South should have laid down its arms when my victory in November of 1864 demonstrated that the North would not surrender the will to win. Instead, they prolonged that war for 6 more months, many thousands of additional and unnecessary deaths, in my opinion, until General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia in April of 1865, almost 4 years to the day since the war had begun, beginning a series of other surrenders by other Confederate armies in other fields to other Union generals. About a week after the surrender of General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, my wife Mary and I decided to celebrate by attending a play at Ford's Theater, a popular theatrical venue in Washington, D.C. We'd been there before. I remember enjoying that play, an English comedy entitled Our American Cousin. But somehow, ladies and gentlemen, I don't remember how it ended. So I guess I'll stop there. Thank you once again for coming out this evening, making this occasion necessary, as they say. And now, although it is very unusual to do so, I will be happy to respond to any queries you might have about my career, my public career, and about the great Civil War from 1861 until 65. Anyone? Thank you. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Well, this is a question about the Civil War, but could you enlighten us about what the issue you had with President Polk, and was it the Mexican War that started? When he started, and for what reason?
President Polk informed the American public that Mexico had started the war. And he ordered United States troops into disputed territory, territory that Mexico claimed. And when Mexico rightly resisted that aggression, he claimed they had fired first and asked for a declaration of war. The war against our sister republic was fought to extend the area of slavery. It was fought to add slave territory to the Union, pure and simple. And so my party, the Whig Party, and huge segments of public opinion at the North opposed that conflict, which was a naked war of aggression. Polk had said in his diary a year before the war began that he sought to acquire the ports of San Francisco and Monterey in Spanish California. And as it turned out, ma'am, there were no weapons of mass destruction in Mexico. Yes, sir.
In your second inaugural, as the war was winding down, you referred to the war in so many words as something the nation had to go through because of the collective sin of slavery. How much of that was really your own thinking and what you believed, or how much of that was designed for public consumption?
A person in a public office giving a public speech, offering public testimony, offers it all for public consumption. And I cannot say that I offered my own interpretation of the conflict or of what the conflict had become by 1865. It was not the conflict at the end that it had been at the beginning. The cause of the war had ceased to exist before the war itself came to an end. I simply repeated the message that I had been hearing from thousands of newspaper editorials, public addresses, and sermons across the North for many years. And I believe that the Civil War was a punishment for the sin of slavery that both sides had to atone for. Yes, sir.
As you mentioned, you yourself thought that in August of 1864, you would be defeated for re-election. And one of our prominent historians, James McPherson, says that if that had happened, then Jefferson Davis might have gone down in history as the great war leader, and you as an also ran. So is it merely an accident of history that you're considered a great president, rather, or an accident of the election timing that you're considered a great president, rather than perhaps the greatest failure as a president, leaving 1 million casualties and 600,000 dead in a failed war effort?
I do not believe that even if I had been defeated, that the effort would have been a failure. We still had a chance to win that war in 4 months between my election and the inauguration of the next president. And even my opponent, General McClellan, said that he did not want to end the war. He would not just lay down arms. So I do not believe that the states at the South would have won that war in any traditional sense. Nor do I believe that slavery would have been reinstituted. It is the slaves themselves that were demanding their own freedom by running away from their masters, joining the Union troops wherever the armies were. I think slavery was like Humpty Dumpty by the end of 1864. It had fallen off the wall and it could never be put back together again. The history would have been different, but the end result would have been the same. And I don't believe that the American people would ever countenance a monument to a man who fought a war in defense of human slavery. Yes, sir.
At the end of that war, what kind of government assistance programs, whatnot, was offered to the slaves to help them readjust to freedom?
Unfortunately, there was not much federal aid to the freedmen, even before the war ended, or certainly after the war. The closest thing we came to a government assistance program was the Freedmen's Bureau, which was an effort to deal with individual former slaves to enable them to negotiate labor contracts, acquire land on their own. Unfortunately, my successor emasculated the Freedmen's Bureau when he became president and made a bad situation worse in my retrospect. Yes, sir.
How tall are you?
Well, sir, I am, I believe, still the tallest person ever to be elected president at 6'4".
No basketball.
No basketball.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Lincoln, I was wondering, I read somewhere where a lot of your cabinet consisted of your opponents. If that is true, why would you have your opponents on your cabinet?
It is true, sir, that I appointed my main rivals for the Republican nomination in 1860 to my cabinet, for the simple reason, sir, that I could keep an eye on them there. And I was the president, and so the rule was 7 nays, 1 aye, the ayes have it. But putting together a cabinet in those days meant giving each region of the country and each faction of the party a representation in the cabinet. And what better way to do that than to put each regional and factional favorite for the nomination where I could keep an eye on. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
I enjoyed the opportunity.